culture. You know?
One of the ironies that I think needs to be brought out here, going back to the phrase, not the book, but the phrase, the satanic verses, is that that legend within Islam actually suggests the Prophet Muhammad's own fallibility. The legend, very briefly, is that the Prophet accepted heathen verses in the Quran and then later retracted them, realizing that they actually deify idols rather than God himself. So that if the Prophet, and he called them the satanic verses, so that if the Prophet is capable of making mistakes and good Muslim men follow in the path of the Prophet, the sunnah of the Prophet, then clearly his companions, the people who transcribed the revelations, and also, exactly, and men and women after that are capable of making mistakes.
Prophet Muhammad himself was always very clear that he was in no sense divine, and in fact criticized Christians for having made a god of their prophet. He said that, you know, he was only, as he himself called himself, the messenger, you know, and in fact one of the reasons for dislike for the ban on representation is that he was worried that if people made pictures of him, they would worship the pictures and so on. And he very much wanted to see himself as a man bringing a message from God, rather than as in some way divine himself. And that, ironically, has gone out the window.
Right.
You know, this religion started by a man who wanted not to be seen as divine, now sees him as divine. A religion in which there is no requirement for a priest class at all, in which you need nobody to intercede with you. With God for you. It's direct communication. You can never go to a mosque in your life and be a good Muslim. You know? That has been replaced by an ideology which is dominated by extremely obscurantist priests. So that's called the true religion, whereas actually it's the opposite. But it's this question of whether you can openly discuss the foundation ideas of your culture. You know? And it seems to me in any you know, $2 philosophy student will tell you that if you can't argue from first principles, you can't argue. You know, if you can't argue about the absolute root, there's nothing to be said. If you have to accept that, all you can have is a kind of pissing contest about how many angels dance on the point of a needle. You know, you can't actually discuss the core questions at all. And that's the problem. That's the problem right there.
And to wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to bring it back to the point that non-Muslims are succumbing to this intimidation as much as Muslims are. In my book, Salman, when I talk about how your story affected me as a young writer and reform-minded Muslim, I point out that as a student in 1988, I personally benefited from the explosion of commentary that came about as a result of your story. The problem, I also said in my book, is that when I went to the public library, pre-internet days, the public library, to look for commentaries, I found that those commentaries were satisfied merely to explain Muslim outrage. They never went as far as to ask whether the Quran is as pristine, as perfect, as divine as the effigy burners would have us believe. And then I asked the very, I think, crucial question, even for today, maybe especially for today. Is multiculturalism losing its mind? By which I meant, has it lost its intellectual spine?
Yes. I mean, that's to say it's decayed into something much less than multiculturalism, which is cultural relativism. I mean, that's to say there's a sense in which multiculturalism, I mean, it's an obvious fact.
Right.
You know,
Look around you.
Yeah, we live in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith world. We do, and we're not going to stop. That's not going to unhappen. You know, so there's an aspect of it which is just, you know, I mean, unarguable. But when this decays into, and by the way, that aspect of it, I have spent most of my life trying to celebrate.
Right.
And saying that it's enriching.
It's a lovely thing.
You know, better food, better clothes, better, you know, all that. And some more important things too. Actually, what is more important than food and clothes? No, sorry, I take that back.
Not necessarily in that order either.
No.
Yeah.
Sport. Yeah. But when it decays into cultural relativism, that is, if you like, the end of a moral sense. Because then you know, to lampoon it, what it means, you can say, oh, well, if it's your culture to kill writers, you should kill them.
Right.
Because it's what your culture is. If it's your culture to impose, you know, clitoridectomies on women, then, gee, I guess that's fine. You know, I'm glad it's not my culture, but if it's your culture, go right ahead. You know, that's the extreme, if you like, the caricature of it, but the day-to-day reality of it has been a weakening of our sense of what our own values actually are. Instead, we constantly seek to appease people who say that our values upset them. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's dangerous not just for the majority communities, but it's dangerous for minority communities. Actually, you know, it's more dangerous for minority communities than for the majority to play that game. Because if cultural relativism is the problem, then the bigger culture will always win.
Right.
You know,
and dissenting voices, voices
yeah.
with, you know, authentic talent, something different to say and to express, will be stifled.
Yeah, and I sometimes feel that Western ears are better tuned to the most conservative Islamic voices. They want to listen to mullahs and other assholes. You know, but the fact that there actually are throughout the Muslim world, you know, it's not just you and me.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of people struggling with these ideas and trying to say, how can we have a modern society in Muslim countries?
Correct.
How can we break the power of the priests? How can we break the power of corrupt politicians and generals, etc., who use religion as a way of holding people down? These conversations happen quietly and often, you know, very quietly, but there's no doubt that they're happening. And yet they're not. Nobody goes looking for that.
Right.
And if you
They're
look
not given a platform.
and if you compare it to, for instance, the way in which we in the West responded to the Soviet Union, we did not listen to the official voices. We didn't believe that, you know, Stalin and Brezhnev and so on, that those were the people to listen to. We went and found those alternative voices, and we gave them enormous privilege. You know, the fact that those samizdat texts were smuggled out of Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and everyone else, those became what we all agreed was the truth. And so we actually looked at the dissident voices as being more valuable than the official voices. And that played its part in the defeat of Soviet communism. We are not doing that in this case. We're doing the opposite. And that's our intellectual failure.
Yeah. Which raises